So it's been brought to my attention that people miss the swords. Swords are not relevant today, but people miss the swords. There you go. So in my last video, I finally copped to my history as a musical theater kid, and well, now the floodgates are open. Let's get obnoxious. So I went to college with this guy we're gonna call Steve. Steve and I were never really the best of friends, but we did mutually acknowledge being, quote, fond of one another during a wine-soaked compliment circle at the end of our first semester. Whether Steve and I got along because we spent 12 of the first 16 credit hours of our college careers together, or whether that situation was just made more pleasant than it could have been by our mutual, quote, fondness, who's to say? But in retrospect, Steve was a really important acquaintance in the formative years of whatever the hell this is. I was just growing into the recreational side of the massive pretension that had gotten me through high school honors English, and Steve struck this perfect balance of ribbing me for using the word ruminate in casual conversation while also rising to the occasion himself. Anyway, Steve got cast as Javert in a summer production of Les Miserables and was working on prepping the role while school was still in session, and he was not the type to do so quietly. So one day during our lunch break, he comes running up to me in the student lounge with this twinkle in his eye and said 4 words that have haunted me to this day. Laura, I fixed stars. What? I fixed stars. By this point, I had at least figured out that we were talking about Javert's Showstopper, and Steve's the kind of guy who, when he's excited about something, you've gotta hear him out, because it's probably gonna be a little weird, and at the very least, it's gonna be a wild ride to hear him tell you about it. So, I played along. You know how it ends like, "This I swear by the stars"? No. It should be, "This I swear by the stars." Well, by the time I went back to class that afternoon, I had half a dissertation written in my head about what a trash f***ing choice Steve was gonna be making that summer.
Hi, I'm Laura, and I am constitutionally incapable of letting anything go ever. Alright, so we need at least a little bit of shared music theory knowledge to get rolling on this. Not a lot, thank God, because I am not a theorist and I'm generally a little bit out of practice, but I want everyone to be able to play along at home, so bear with me. If you know a little bit about music and you're familiar with the terms on the screen and you suspect that my haphazard attempts to give a grossly oversimplified explanation of them will be more painful than entertaining, you are probably right, so feel free to skip to this timestamp. So if you look at a piano keyboard, you'll see 88 keys. If you look a little closer, you'll notice that there's a pattern of 12 that repeats 7 times and some change. The notes within each one of those sequences of 12 relate to one another in the same way. So even though it does matter to an extent which particular iteration you're looking at, we start by giving them all the same names with the letters A through G. Yes, that is only 7 letters for 12 notes. Sit tight and we'll get there in a second. Alright, so we've essentially got 12 notes at our disposal, but most pieces don't use all of them equally. They lean on a subgroup of notes called a scale. In Western music, there are 2 main scales that get used the most often: major and minor. Each of these scales has 7 notes, which is why Western music uses 7 basic note names. If you're looking at a piano, the white keys get the letters, and the black keys are named using one of the adjacent white keys, and then either sharp to say up or flat to say down. So this note is called C, and this one is D, so this is either called C sharp or D flat, depending on the context. If you're using a piano and you play all the white keys, you're playing either a C major or A minor scale, depending on where you start, but you can get a major or minor scale by starting on any note and using sharps or flats to build the appropriate intervals from there. Building your scale based on a different note will give your piece a slightly different character and make it easier or more difficult to play on various instruments or for various people to sing, but again, as long as you've correctly established your 7 notes, it'll function in basically the same way. That means that sometimes it's important to establish which note your scale starts on, like, say, if you're actually going to play or sing the piece, but for our conversation today, it mostly doesn't matter so much, so rather than hearing me name specific notes by their letters, you'll mostly hear me say numbers that refer to the steps of the scale. The 5th, the 6th, the 2nd, etc. You'll also hear me refer to the key note, which just means the note the scale is built on. Which brings me to key. A piece that draws most of its notes from a certain scale can be said to be in that scale's key. So if your piece is mainly using the white keys, it's either in the key of C major or A minor. We'll get to how you tell the difference in a minute. That doesn't mean that those are the only notes in the piece, but notes that aren't in that scale are going to stand out in particular ways. They're called accidentals. A piece also doesn't always end in the same key it starts in. You can do what's called a key change, which is the thing that allows Beyoncé to keep singing the same melody while still singing higher and higher and higher at the end of Love on Top. Right, so let's talk about that distinction between C major and A minor. Major and minor scales are related in this really special way. If you take a major scale but start on the 6th, you get a minor scale. And if you take a minor scale but start on the 3rd, you get a major scale. We call this relationship a relative minor or major. So if you're using the same notes, how do you know what key you're in? Well, if your piece isn't an a cappella solo, one way is through chord structure. A chord is a stack of notes played together, and there are 3 different basic functions they can have. Tonic, which feels stable or finished, subdominant, which creates movement away from the tonic, and dominant, which leads back to the tonic. This moment of moving back to the tonic is called resolution. A piece of music is resolved when it reaches a point where it sounds stable or finished. You get little resolutions throughout the piece where sections or phrases end, and you get a big resolution when the piece is over. The most resolved that a piece can be is when the melody lands on the key note and the harmony or accompaniment fill out the rest of the tonic chord that has that note as its root. This is how you tell whether a piece is in major or minor. Which chord tends to function as the tonic? And which note does the melody tend to resolve to? In particular, how does the piece end? It's not always totally clear. Sometimes a piece will go back and forth so much that it's kind of a subjective judgment call to tell whether the piece as a whole is in major or minor, but the rule of thumb is that you end on the key note with the tonic filled out around it. When I was 6 and taking piano lessons and had to memorize my first piece for a recital, my teacher called the keynote the magic note and made sure that it was the first thing her students memorized about a piece. Because in the case of an absolute train wreck of a brain fart, you could hit your magic note before calling it a day, and it would at least sort of sound like your piece had an ending. So in the very elementary sense, Steve had, in fact, fixed stars, because the melody of stars doesn't end on the key note. It ends on the 5th, which is the root of the most commonly used chord with dominant function. So it really does sound like it wants to pop up there. But Javert doesn't sing the keynote, but the trombone, keyboards, guitar, bass, and cello all play it. Plus, the thing about a chord with tonic function is that if you're used to hearing Western music, it serves to reinforce that the keynote is there and suggest that it's the most important thing you should be hearing, even if it's not. Plus, the 5th is in the tonic. So even though the melody itself doesn't fully resolve, it helps to tell you that the piece as a whole is resolved. So the song as written doesn't sound unfinished, it just sounds a little less done than maybe it could. And look, if I, at the age of 6, could tell you that the melody is supposed to end on the keynote, you can bet your ass Claude Michel Schoenberg knew that too. Now, I don't say that out of a desire to wade into the muddy waters of authorial intent. I don't know that it matters what Claude Michel Schoenberg was thinking when he wrote that note, but I am going to invite you to consider that now that the note has been written, it, in and of itself, means something. So, what does an unresolved melody mean?
Hey, what's up? Laura from the future just popping in to say, had some technical difficulties the day of the shoot. The audio on this next take is real bad. I promise it gets better after that, so just sit tight. Also, Laura from the past, if you are listening, you're about to go on a hike at Abalone Cove. For the love of all that is holy, reapply your sunblock.
Well, in Les Mis, they actually happen a lot. One big source of them is when a character dies. Valjean and Fantine actually both croquet on the exact same musical idea. And what do you know? It's the fifth. This does sound a lot less finished than Stars does because of what's happening in the orchestra. Instead of resolving to the tonic major 1, it hangs out on the dominant major 5. It really wants to resolve, but it very pointedly just doesn't. So we've got a break with convention here that leaves the song sounding totally unfinished. Why? Well, it's pretty simple. Something's not finished. In Fantine's case, she dies tragically young, leaving behind a daughter who needs to be cared for. The orchestra does resolve her melody after she can't, but it still lands on the fifth. Valjean dies peacefully after the full resolution of all of his narrative threads, but Les Mis is pretty pointed about its theology in general, and it's kind of whacking you over the head with it here. Valjean is now a good, godly man, and he is going to heaven. So this isn't the end of his life, it's the beginning of his everlasting life, and Fantine and Eponine's too. Now, most songs in musical theater in general, and in Les Mis specifically, do have fully resolved endings, because even if the plot as a whole isn't resolved, the moment is. So Valjean's soliloquy that ends the prologue section, where he realizes that the world has turned him into a bit of a jackass, but maybe he doesn't have to be, doesn't fully resolve. He doesn't know what's coming next, he just knows it's something new. But Who Am I, where he realizes that what he needs to do is turn himself in to save another man's life, ends with not one, but two very heroic resolutions. Valjean may not know exactly what's going to happen after he turns himself in, but the music is telling us that what's important is that he has posed the question, who am I, and answered it. Which brings us to Stars. What does it tell us that the melody doesn't fully resolve? Well, what's happening here? Javert has just seen evidence that the man who escaped him all these years ago is close by, and he swears to heaven that he will find him and bring him to justice. Now, we could expect this melody to fully resolve if making that vow were the most important thing. But Javert is not one of those fragile snowflakes who wants a participation trophy. None of this means anything if he can't catch the bastard. Valjean's God cares about intentions. Javert's God cares about results. And this is baked into more than just the very end of the song. The phrase leading up to it passes through a resolution that happens here.
Safe behind bars, I will never rest.
Musically speaking, bars is a heroic moment that clarifies and resolves on rest. But bars is the end of a sentence. Rest is not. So Javert's kind of fighting the music here, and specifically fighting its attempts to resolve. Just like Valjean needed to resolve his melody twice, Javert needs to resist resolving it twice. And not only is his phrasing fighting the melody, his melody is fighting the orchestration. In that big moment where he's holding on the fifth, the entire orchestra is walking down the scale and actually lands on the keynote and then has to pull away from it to finish out the song. This melody wants to resolve very traditionally, but Javert won't let it. But there's actually more going on here than just whether or not the melody resolves. This song doesn't exist in a musical vacuum. It's contextualized by the entire rest of the score, and that score starts like this. For For those of you playing along at home, yes, that is a pop from the fifth up to the keynote. Not only is that the first thing the audience of Les Mis hears, it's also, inverted, the first thing Javert sings. It's literally how he introduces himself.
And I'm Javert!
And yes, this interval does sound a little different here than it would in Stars because we're in minor rather than major, and the chord structure's doing different things, but it is established so relentlessly that, to my ear at least, it does become more about the interval than the key. So it's significant that in this first interaction between Javert and Valjean, Javert establishes this interval, Valjean keeps trying to pull them away from it, and Javert keeps leading them back. While that's happening musically, Valjean is arguing that he did nothing truly wrong, while Javert is arguing that the only thing that matters is that he broke the law. So we can gather that that's what this interval means musically: law and order, authority and imprisonment. And that's what's going on every time we hear this little motif. It's repeated toward the end of the first act to tell us that France's poor are prisoners of the system that keeps them in poverty. And of course, Javert sings it every time he believes he's caught Valjean. As we move into the second act and the revolution really gets popping, this interval is consistently associated with the French army.
You're on your own, you have no friends.
While the boys at the barricade either find a different path to the keynote or refuse to resolve at all. That's even how this interval works with the twin resolutions at the end of Who Am I? Valjean resolves down when he answers who he is to himself, but he pops up when he answers who he is in the eyes of the law. This interval represents the proper order of things, as Mr. Lawful Neutral over here sees it, with the good, godly men on top and the criminal sinners under their boots. As long as Valjean walks free, this order is upset, and that is the entire point of Stars. It implies this particular resolution because Javert vows that he will restore the proper order of things, but it doesn't go there because the proper order of things has not yet been restored.
Now, up to this point, I've been a little hard on poor Steve. I've been talking like he's uniquely an uncultured swine who thought he was smarter than the entire institution of musical theater, and that's not fair. He really just hadn't spent enough time running with the MT kids to know that the type of fix he was suggesting has a name: optioning up. It's very common practice for actors who have the chops to go ahead and hit higher notes than those written in the score. That's why the last line of Let It Go sounds like this in the movie,
The cold never bothered me anyway.
and this on Broadway.
The cold never bothered me anyway.
Now, I want to make sure it's on the record here that I am not at all opposed to optioning up as a rule. And I think this moment from Frozen is actually a great example of what can be fun about it.
This is a moment where Elsa is fully herself for the first time, and here we have two different interpretations of who that is. Idina Menzel tells us that the freedom Elsa has found relieves her anxiety and allows her to be, by turns, elated and cool as a cucumber, while Cassie Levy doubles down on the euphoric glee of finally being able to see her powers as a talent instead of a danger. Both of these takes work just fine at this point in Elsa's arc, and taking or not taking that option up is a great way for any actress who tackles this role to tell us something about her Elsa specifically. Granted, it's also a vehicle for the high note arms race, whereby the physical capability to outbelt Idina Menzel has become a baseline expectation for any actress who wants to work in musical theater, and it's a big showy high note to propel the audience out to intermission, but those things aren't always mutually exclusive. Sometimes the prettiest, showiest, most fun option is also a great way to tell the story you want to tell. It's awesome when the stars align like that, but sometimes they don't. See, Frozen is actually a pretty great counterpoint to Les Mis here. Frozen is told both through spoken dialogue and through song, and its music is pretty self-contained. It runs the gamut in terms of musical styles, and musical ideas don't tend to show up more than once except as explicit reprises. Les Mis, on the other hand, is the epitome of what's called a sung-through musical, which means it has no spoken dialogue at all. And unlike the self-contained songs of Frozen, Les Mis is constantly repeating musical ideas. Entire melodies show up from one act to the next in entirely different contexts with entirely different lyrics. The lovely ladies of the first act become the young war widows of the second, end. Fantine's death becomes Eponine's unrequited love. That one's my personal favorite because it's a melody that tells you that a character is speaking to someone who's not there. There's a specific moment when they get pulled back to reality and everything. It's so specific, and musical theater is amazing. There's a melody for when the authority of the state collides with a lawbreaker, and one for money changing hands. Hey girl, Claude Michel Schoenberg heard you liked leitmotifs, so he got you a leitmotif for your leitmotif. Every single note is not only incredibly deliberate, but given the proper context to clarify it. With this much to draw from, even small changes can change a whole lot.
Now, does this mean it's just bad to take any artistic liberties when performing Les Mis or any sung-through musical in general? No, of course not. You know why? Go nuts, go ape shit. Take all of the artistic liberties MTI will legally allow you to take. This isn't some veneration of Les Miserables, platonic ideal of the Broadway musical. Fuck Les Miserables! But like, go with me on this for a second. Unironically, pour Les Miserables a glass of wine, and take Les Miserables to bed before it's even had a chance to finish it, and show Les Miserables all the pleasure it didn't know was possible while it's been stuck with its stuffy, closeted spouse it married right out of high school. Make sweet, dirty, kinky, passionate, messy, degenerate love to Les Miserables until it's never the same musical again. Just, you know, make sure you've got enthusiastic and ongoing consent. This metaphor got away from me. Look, what I'm trying to say is nothing must needs be held sacred, but things mean things. Actors, particularly scripted theater actors, work in this really interesting center of the Venn diagram between artists and essayists. We have to interpret an existing and oftentimes familiar text in order to develop a performance that tells what we deem to be an important piece of the story. And this is true of other artists as well, musicians who make covers, everyone else working in theater. As an artist, it can be tempting to make choices that are pretty or showy or fun at the expense of the story you're trying to tell. And as an essayist, it can be easy to dismiss the finest details of the text as unimportant or even as accidental flaws. But the most interesting artistic work happens when every piece of the puzzle is supporting one overarching story. And the most interesting analytical work happens when you take every bit of the text at its word and follow it to its conclusion. That doesn't mean putting the text on some sort of untouchable pedestal, but it does mean accepting that everything that is part of it is part of it. You're not going to fix it, not without breaking it. But with a little deliberate care, attention, and love, well, you just might be able to seduce it.
This video was very much made possible by the generous support of all of my patrons, with an extra special thank you to Kaya, Critters Mai, Barry, and Akkan Diabas. If you would like to become my patron and see your name up on this screen and also see the real doozy of an outtakes reel from this video, you can do that at patreon.com/Laura Crone. I also have a Ko-fi and an Amazon wishlist if you would like to support me that way. A big thank you also to Brian Horn, who served as my musical theater expert script consultant for this video. Brian is a composer and a musical director and a top-notch Tony's live tweeter. You should absolutely follow him. Brian and I also once played the same role in competing semi-professional productions of the same musical in one season, so if you would like to try to guess which role that was, I will confirm or deny in the comments section.